In today's episode of the Iman Wire podcast.
Islam as a tradition, as a historical tradition, is not static, it's dynamic. And it's one that is shaped by the past as well as the present. And this is what our ulama are constantly trying to navigate, right? Navigate the past and the present and sort of forge a path forward for the Ummah in a way that is affirming of who we are. This is a challenge. It's not easy. And you're not going to have everyone agree on what that should be.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Iman Wire podcast. Salim here. Joining me today is Dr. Youshaa Patel, who is an associate professor of religious studies at Lafayette College and author of the book, The Muslim Difference, Defining the Line Between Believers and Unbelievers from Early Islam to the Present. Dr. Patel, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the podcast.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's my pleasure and honor to be here.
We are indeed honored to have you here. So glad you could make it. There is a, just to set the stage a little bit, there's a well-known hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that's found in the Sunan of Abu Dawood, where he ﷺ said, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum." Whoever resembles, imitates a people becomes one of them. This idea of imitation, of tashabbuh, which, as you will get into, as you point into in your book, it's it means imitation, but it's also in the family of Arabic words that also connote elements of ambiguity, uncertainty, confusion. And so we see Muslims over the centuries trying to clarify, understand this hadith. The general import of meaning is that, avoid imitation of other communities, of other faith communities. And then the corollary of this, and found in other narrations of the Prophet ﷺ, is the fact that, Muslims need to be different. And so the underlying question faced by Muslims, both past and present, is, okay, how are we different? How are we different from others, and by how much? So you explore this question in your book, and it's really quite a journey, I must say, in this book. Delving into psychology of imitation, you're going into the weeds of hadith sciences, of taxonomy and isnad, and then moving on to history and the sociology, the structure of empire and the pre-modern Muslim world. The Mongols dealing with European colonialism, and then fiqh debates about dyeing the dyeing the beard, or alarm clocks, drinking coffee in coffee houses. There's so much in this book. It's pretty humbling and exciting for me to see a book literally just discussing one hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. But it's certainly even more humbling, and I'm sure for you as well, to find that previous Muslim scholars wrote multiple volumes on this topic of this one hadith. So I want to begin there. First, tell us a little bit about what moved you to make this book, and then from there on, speak to the language of the hadith, this concept of tashabbuh. And if you could situate the hadith in its original context at the time of the Prophet ﷺ.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillahi al-Kareem wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Thank you, Salim. That was actually a really good summary. Sure, you don't want to carry on with the podcast yourself. But yeah, no, I'd love to share a little bit about my journey coming to this subject, which sort of absorbed me for nearly 15 years of my life, and I think still absorbs me, and is in some ways something that you can't stop thinking about when you begin thinking about imitation and the power of imitation, and how much it shapes who we are, who we have been, and who we become as individuals and as collectivities. It's hard not to think about it on an almost daily basis. So I'll start with reading a little bit from the preface of the book, where I talk about how I came to the subject, and then open up into a broader discussion of the hadith in kind of early Islam, if that makes sense. So I was a recent graduate from the University of Michigan, where I was pre-med and then major in economics. I was working as a management consultant in Chicago. So one Friday, I was sitting in a mosque on the north side, listening to a sermon, to a khutbah. The preacher, a well-known Sufi sheikh in the local Muslim community, proclaimed that, quote, Muslims must be different, end quote, not just on the inside by cultivating a virtuous character, but on the outside as well by dressing distinctively. Delivered as the U.S. government was launching its post-9/11 war on terror and intensifying its surveillance of American Muslims, the sermon urged the congregation to resist the mounting pressure to assimilate. I listened attentively, waiting to hear how the sheikh would draw from the Islamic tradition. But instead of citing the Quran, he invoked the charismatic authority of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, citing hadiths that urge Muslims to be different from Jews and Christians, including the well-known saying, whoever imitates a people becomes one of them, or man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum, implying that if Muslims copied the ways of other people, they would eventually become like them and lose their religion. Being different, he argued, was in fact an Islamic doctrine. But as I left the mosque that day, I was still not convinced. If Muslims must indeed be different, how different must they be? That question lingered in my mind as I made the decision later that year to change my profession and enter the academy. I enrolled in Duke University's graduate program in religious studies with a focus on Islam. So the sermon in Chicago on Muslim difference inspired a term paper, graduate school, that evolved into a dissertation, my PhD dissertation, directed by my advisor, Professor Ibrahim Musa. So although I was initially reluctant to devote several years of my life to the subject, during a visit to Princeton, Professor Michael Cook convinced me that this topic was indeed worthy of my time. Quote, it would be like throwing a small brick into a large window, end quote. With a small act of destruction in mind, I opted to undertake my dissertation research at the Asad National Library in the ancient city of Damascus, home to a monumentally unpublished manuscript of the Ottoman Arab Sufi jurist Najm-ud-Din al-Ghazi, who died in 1651. The civil war that would soon engulf the country had yet to break out, although some signs indicated that all was not well. So after I undertook and completed my research in Damascus, I returned back to the United States, completed my dissertation, and then eventually got a position at Lafayette College where I am now, where I, over the last several years, worked on completing the book. So that's how I got into the subject of Tashabbuh, of imitation. And so I'll first talk about the term in a little bit more detail. So tashabbaha yatashabbahu tashabbuhun. Tashabbuhun is a fifth form term in the Arabic language, and it suggests something of a self-reflexivity. I've translated it usually in the book as imitation, but as I also state, it's a subject that it's a term that can also take on other meanings. It's semantic field, as we say in academia. Its range of possible meanings is more expansive even than imitation. So resemblance, assimilation, or mimesis are some other terms that one can use. I've had arguments with people that say, no, it should not be translated as imitates. It should be translated as resembles. Other academics have translated as, do not, assimilate. I think imitation is, I tend to use that translation, but I want the audience to know that when you're translating any term, such as between Arabic and English, sometimes it's not just a simple homology, a one-to-one thing. It can be multiple terms at once, and so there's always a decision a translator has to make. I chose imitation because, number one, it implies that there's an issue of intention. Or at least there can be an issue of intention. Do I intend to imitate someone else, or is it something that's unconscious? And this is actually one of the criteria that ulama look at when they're trying to determine whether how serious a particular case of imitation is within the Islamic fiqh tradition. So that's one of the reasons why I chose it. Another reason is because imitation also is connected to the word image. You can just simply sound it out when you look at the etymology. And when you think about it, see and do. That's what babies do. They see and do. That's what my baby daughter does. She sees and does. It's scary how much she copies, even when you're not looking. And that is often how imitation works. There's an emphasis on the visual dimension or field, as it were. And that helps to explain, I would argue, I think conceptually, why so many of the practices that we see in the Islamic tradition being labeled as tashabbuh or coming within the ambit of tashabbuh are visual, and involve sight, being visibly Muslim. And we'll, inshallah, get into that. So that helps just to contextualize why I chose that particular translation normally, although I often sort of veer off depending on the context. So it's important that your audience has something of a sense of the meaning of this term, but also to understand that tashabbuh in Arabic is distinctive. It's, imitation is one way to talk about it, but in reality, it's more expansive than even imitation and can kind of encompass a whole set of terms. Now, going to the second part of your question about thinking about the subject of tashabbuh within early Islam. And this is a subject of debate among, early, historians of early Islam, because it touches upon this topic of if and when Muslims began to define themselves as a distinct community, right? And so you have a range of, within the academic literature, range of theories and ideas over how and when this happened. And so this subject touches upon that, which is why it's, at least among academic historians, a subject of debate. However, one thing that I try to do in the book is that often historians tend to be dismissive of hadith. Dismissive in the sense that they doubt whether they can tell us something authoritative about the early history of Islam. And I'm speaking of secular historians, not necessarily believing Muslim historians. And there's something of a divide there within academia. And one thing that I try to do in the book is to, I guess you could argue, bridge that divide to some degree, and make the argument or the case that we shouldn't be dismissive of the hadith tradition in terms of the information and the insights it can provide us into the early history of Islam, including the Prophet ﷺ policy with regard to non-Muslims. And so this is, one of the topics that I think is important to touch upon. And, another reason why I became drawn to the subject is because tashabbuh has traditionally been a way for Muslims to think about how they interact with others, especially Jews and Christians, but other kinds of non-Muslims as well. And it has shaped, Muslim identity in that way. And it helps to show how much being Muslim, right, what it means to be Muslim, past and present, is defined through our relations and our connections or separations from those who are different from us. And so that's another reason why I feel like the subject is not only interesting historically, but I think very relevant to the present moment and relevant to what it means to be Muslim today, and for that matter, in the future. So, but kind of rewinding to the early history of Islam, there is an interesting hadith alongside this that is sometimes cited, and it's narrated on the authority of Ibn Abbas, where he states that the Prophet ﷺ used to love to agree with, muwafaqa, and conform to the practices of the people of the book. And when you read that statement, if you're kind of coming just from a surface level perspective, you're like, wow, that's interesting. And then Ibn Abbas, radiallahu anhu, and who is the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, continues and says that except when he was commanded to do otherwise. So what he tells us is that, at least for a particular point in time, that the Prophet's default policy was to emulate the Ahlul Kitab, right, the people of the book, and who are most commonly understood to be Jews and Christians. So that would suggest that within the religious landscape of Arabia, which was diverse, right? It was not only pagans, not only idol worshippers, but you had Christian tribes, you had Jewish tribes, and you had figures as the Hunafa or the Hanifs, who were non-conforming monotheists. So there, what was what was the policy? And so we learn from Ibn Abbas that, for example, the Prophet ﷺ would style his hair in a particular way so as to emulate Jews and Christian styles of hair and differentiate his style of hair from that of the pagans. So in other words, let his hair fall down and not part it. So, you might see that hadith, and that's kind of strange. Why would parting the hair or not parting the hair be such a big deal, right? And the reality is that the emphasis on physical appearance is not unusual in that way during that particular time. It indicates to us that how you looked was an important indicator of who you were. And it told people in 7th century Arabia, I belong to this group, I belong to this tribe, I belong to this community. And it was important for the Prophet ﷺ to indicate that this is who we are. And in this particular time, we align ourselves with the Ahlul Kitab, and we do not align ourselves with the pagan Quraysh. So this is something that I think is useful. It's good to know. And then we learn later that the Prophet would change his, according to Ibn Abbas and according to the same tradition, changed his hairstyle to actually strangely align with the pagans. And you wonder, well, why does he begin to part his hair towards the end of his life or the latter part of his prophecy? My argument in the book is that what it indicates to us is that not that the Prophet ﷺ was deliberately wanting to look like a pagan or look like a polytheist. That doesn't make any sense. Rather, what it tells us is that, after towards the end of his life, right, Arabia had more or less come under the banner of Islam. And so just differentiating himself and his followers from polytheists, from the mushrikun, was no longer a priority. The priority had changed, and now, as it were, and perhaps most of us are familiar with the command in the Quran to shift and change the direction of prayer from facing Jerusalem to facing the Kaaba and Mecca, and that's mentioned in the Quran. And so this pivot, this literal physical pivot, which I think had symbolic value and appears to have had symbolic value not only to Muslim believers but also to non-Muslim observers who were contemporary to him, is one of the primary indicators that we have of this realization of independence, right? That we are a distinctive community. We are not like other communities. Yes, we are monotheistic. Yes, we have our kitab, the Quran, but we are a distinctive community and we pray in a distinctive way, even while it, ironically is still similar to how what we would call Orthodox Jews pray today. They face in a particular direction. They stand up, they bow, and they prostrate, and they recite. And Muslims did that too, but they did so in a different way. And so the hadith on hairstyle, and the Prophet's shifting, or at least adaptations, aligns with this trajectory that we see in the Quran of a realization of the early Muslim community of a level of independence, even while still acknowledging their affinities and their connections and their sharedness with other monotheistic communities who were living within and beyond Arabia during that time. So trying to make sense of all that is challenging, but it gets us into this whole tashabbuh thing, right? So many of the other hadith traditions also talk about physical appearance, like how to wrap a turban, like what is the way to do that? Other matters of dress, beard style, right? Whether to grow one's beard or to shave, one's beard, to dye one's beard. These are many of the traditions that came under the remit of tashabbuh and that later ulama would discuss when talking about the importance of distinction and difference in terms of what it means to be Muslim in public life. And I should emphasize that many of these traditions, I would argue, and I do argue in the book, is about shaping a distinctive Islamic public. What does it mean to be in the public space? And how does one project one's identity, one's distinction and difference in publics where in religiously plural publics, right? If everyone's the same, doesn't really, I guess, everyone's the same, then it isn't that important to, hey, tell everybody, hey, look, I'm Muslim. But if you're within a religiously plural public, and we must acknowledge that during the first centuries of Islam and beyond Arabia, Muslims were a minority, right? I mean, people didn't just convert to Islam just like that.
Right.
It took several centuries, whether it be in Damascus or in other places. I mean, you did have Amsar, which were cities that were built from the ground up, which were majority Muslim. But other than that, generally speaking, beyond Arabia, Muslims were minorities. And so indicating one's identity and projecting and creating an Islamic public and a distinctive Islamic style, and I think that's something you discussed in some other podcasts, was something that Muslims had begun to do. And I think can serve as a model, and maybe we'll talk about this for Muslims today in terms of how to create their own distinctive Islamic style.
Right. And you mentioned how it's a form of developing identity, especially for a nascent community, right? To set yourself apart, to give you some distinctive markers, but that the Prophet ﷺ, if we were to glean through the meanings of these multiple narrations, it was not with the intention to be entirely foreign, I guess you could say. You still are still speaking the same language of style, but there's differences, but they're not so extreme differences that the other communities would not sort of understand you, if I said that correctly.
Yeah, excellent. That's a really good summary of one of the main. I mean, there are many arguments I'm making in the book and many messages I want to convey. And one of the messages I want to convey is to think about, to think number one and recognize that difference is a spectrum, right? You can have very kind of overt oppositionality, right? Being very, very, very different in a kind of almost in a blatant kind of way. And then you can be different in other ways you can moderate that difference along this sliding scale, if you were. So one way is to think about what was the Prophet ﷺ doing? And where along this continuum of difference did he attempt to fit the community, right? And this involves kind of a level of interpretation and analysis. I remember, before I even undertook my dissertation research in Damascus, I did sort of something of a scout of Damascus. Is this a place I want to spend some time in? So in 2007, I took a visit to Damascus, and I was eating a chapli burger outside with a friend of mine. And we were speaking English, and someone walked by us with a backpack, and he overheard us speaking English and began, initiated a conversation. And I would later learn that he was 21 years old, that he had made hijrah from the United Kingdom, and he seemed to be quite, angry. If I could make that make that observation from that conversation. And he began explaining why. I asked him, why? What brought you, or what sort of precipitated you and inspired you to make hijrah from the United States and move, as it were, to Syria? And this is 2007. And he kind of gave me a number of reasons, about focusing on the kuffar and kind of citing Islamic and religious, I guess, scripture. And one of the things that he mentioned was that we're not able to imitate them. We're not even supposed to imitate them, right? This idea that being Muslim, to be authentically Muslim, right, meant opposition to non-Muslims and non-Muslim mainstream culture, as it were. And he didn't use the word culture, but that was kind of the gist of what he was saying. And it struck me. I was like, oh, wow. And I didn't mention that, this is what I was planning to do my research on. I kind of just, I think I was just listening to him, realizing that, he was young and he clearly didn't feel like he belonged, right, in British society. And, one can't also jump to conclusions, and, one would have to kind of also look beneath the surface of that, and there may be racial, ethnic, and all class. I mean, there's so many other issues that define who we are, right? I couldn't get all of that nuance within a single conversation. But the fact that he cited this particular doctrine to me in Imitation as helping to justify why it was Islamically sort of correct, as it were, to kind of leave, the only country he had known at that point, struck me. And it struck me that many folks, when they come across these hadith traditions, they don't have the context for it. And they can easily misunderstand, like many other traditions and many other doctrines, what they mean and what the Prophet ﷺ intended by them. And the book is an attempt to make sense of all of these traditions, not all of these traditions, but many of these traditions, and this doctrine of imitation more broadly. So I argue that, no, I don't think that the Prophet ﷺ was intending to completely segregate, as it were, Muslims and the Muslim community from the rest of the world in a way that it created this impenetrable, metaphorical, figurative wall between them and others. That's not what the Prophet was doing, even though some of the language, right, is strong, like khaliful Yahud, like do the opposite or be different from the Yahud. But when you look at what the practice is, it's like, dye your hair a particular color. It's something in terms of the scale. What I argue is the scale is small, right? It's small in terms of the scale. So, and this characterizes so many of the hadiths that employ this language of imitation, do not imitate. Or we also find, khalifu, do the opposite, or la tashabbuh, do not imitate. It's usually, and I can only find one exception to this, it's usually appended to a specific act. And almost always that act is, what we would think is small, or at least involve some kind of corporeal technique, to employ this term from this one sociological thinker. A gesture even. And so this helps us just to put in perspective that, and when you look at then the actual historical practice of Muslims, they actually did acquire and incorporate so many practices from the world around them. Like, for example, to run an empire, you mentioned empire in the introduction. Right. There's no way that Muslims could have learned how to run an empire of this scale, of what became known as a caliphate, without employing non-Muslims who had, worked within the Byzantine empires and the Persian empires, which are the two great superpowers at that time that surrounded Arabia. That's just one example. There's so many others. And so we have to look at the big picture. We have to look at the whole story, as it were, when we're trying to put into perspective these ahadiths. And that's what I try to do in the book.
Yeah, I think it's, and to sort of, to go off the point about empire, you make a, I think, a very important point in the early Muslim period, once we get past the time of the Prophet ﷺ, where you can say that maybe the understanding of these narrations about being different or not imitating, they had more of a perhaps neutral sort of feel to them, or positive in the sense that, like, we're asserting our identity, we're a community. It's a sense of belonging to a community. But then as this complexity of the Muslim expansion and trying to build trying to run an empire brings in a lot of different groups. And these groups, I think, like, and you point out that, like, back in that time, faith and culture were so intertwined. There was a faith community. It's not like now. It's like a faith community was a culture in itself. And so distinguishing, between those two faith communities was essentially a distinction of culture and style as well. In some of those small differences which you mentioned. But I like to hear more about, this important point about the early Muslim period in this imitation of the empires around them, and trying to figure out how to run this new empire. Because honestly, it's sort of, they in a sense imitated the Persians and the Byzantines in how to run an empire. And how they ran an empire, as you mentioned, is that they were very clear in differentiating groups within the society, like into these hierarchical these group, these subdivisions of groups. So they imitated that because that was the way that empire ran. And then they employ the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ of do not imitate to use that to maintain this hierarchical structure. And yet it's all pinned originally about them imitating the Persians and the Byzantines in the first place, but then they're using the hadith to try to maintain differences, but they were imitating the Persians and Byzantines anyway. So I mean, if you could talk a little bit about that, because I think that's actually a very important point in sort of understanding. I think a lot of the cultural and social circumstances of the early Muslim period and how they saw themselves vis-a-vis the other communities.
Yeah, no, you're getting into the more some of the more complex and dimensions of the book, and one of my struggles, or at least efforts and intentions, was to try to, as I mentioned, contextualize these hadith traditions. And one way to do that was to also think about the political context, right? So we find, for example, a document, and I'm saying quotes, because we don't have physical copies of this document or this decree, but we have literary representations of this decree, but what's known as the Pact of Omar, from during the caliphate attributed to the Caliph Omar, the second Caliph Omar radiallahu anhu. And interestingly, when you look at this pact or these ordinances, many of them which attempt to govern sort of non-Muslim subjects now living under this entity that became known as the caliphate. How do we manage those non-Muslim communities? Is it okay for them to publicly go out in public, for example, and celebrate their festivals? And if so, how should they do so? Should there be differences or distinctions in dress so that they should be recognizably distinct from Muslims? If so, how? Right. And interestingly, in most of the documents that have come down, or at least the literary representations of this decree that have come down, we find some elements of tashabbuh there, even the language, where the residents, right, whether it be in Damascus or some other town that would come under the rule of the caliphate, would say, we will not resemble them in etc., in our dress, etc. And they use the word tashabbuh. And it's interesting, we're not emulate them in these certain ways. And so that the fact that this language pops up in this political or this sphere of government, it then provoked me to think about the relation between the subject and politics, because it is political as well. And when you get into shaping public life and what public life should look like, it's political. So, for example, when Switzerland says Muslims cannot erect a minaret in Switzerland, this is a political act, right? It's because it's helping to define the aesthetics of public space. So we then get into this idea of empire. What is an empire? What do empires do? And so there are many ways of thinking about empire, and one theory or one way of thinking about it that I found compelling is to think of empire as political forms that enforce hierarchy, and meaning that is one of the distinctive features of what empires do, besides being expansionist entities. So I found that to be compelling. And then when I looked at the tashabbuh hadith, right, the scriptures, and one of the things that I haven't talked about yet, and that I do talk about in the book, is that not only is this language employed for mediating and governing relations between Muslims and non-Muslims, but one thing that surprised me, and some of us are maybe familiar with this particular hadith that of condemning mutashabbihuna bin nisa and mutashabbihat bir rijal. Men who imitate women and women who imitate men. This is a hadith that was actually cited in that I guess, somewhat controversial Navigating Differences document, for example, that the ulama sent out maybe a year ago. I don't remember,
Right. Yeah.
about a year ago, and signed on to about gender, right? And it caused a lot of controversy within the Muslim community and polarized the Muslim community, especially between progressives and conservatives or traditionalists. But that hadith, and I didn't miss the fact that the hadith was cited. But that is another sort of realm, right? Gender relations in which the Tashabbuh doctrine expands to, but then other social relations as well, between free persons and slaves, between Bedouin Arabs and settled Arabs, between the elderly or seniors and youth or young people.
Right.
And so it kind of struck me like, wow, this is more than just about Muslims and non-Muslims. This is something bigger. What is going on here? Why did the Ahlul Hadith, right, the partisans of Hadith, take it upon themselves to collect these traditions and include them in their compilations? Like, there must have been some understanding of a vision of Islam that they had in mind, a social vision of Islam, an ideal Islamic society. And so this is one of the hypotheses I advance in the book, that there's a larger project going on here that we can see happening through the Tashabbuh traditions. And one that I argue is coherent and consistent with the objectives of empire. What does that mean? In other words, if empire is sustained by instituting social hierarchies and ensuring that they take place, then these hadith traditions have a similar, as it were, function in enforcing certain hierarchies between Muslims and non-Muslims, men and women, free persons and slaves, the young and the old, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not merely on planes of equality. Rather, there is this idea that these differences and should be hierarchical, should, as it were, convey some kind of social hierarchy into the world. And this is something that I argue in the book, an argument that I haven't seen been advanced by others in the past, and maybe something that others might argue with, but or quibble with, but one that I think there's a good amount of evidence. So then the question becomes, right, and what about Muslims today, right? How do we make sense of these hadith traditions today if we no longer live under empire? So that's something that I grapple with in the conclusion of the book. Right. So,
yeah. I mean, in terms of the empire, just so like I understand, I think I mentioned how the Muslims were imitating sort of the style of governance of the Persians and the Byzantines, and like one of the things you imagine, for example, the Persians would distinguish between elites and non-elites or commoners, and so like there was a stratification. But I think just like, so maybe to help us understand, like the whole idea of an empire is you have a sovereign, a king, right? And you have from the very beginning at the top, there's this line of command, this line of order, and so you need those demarcations of status, like, and they have to go basically filter all the way through the society to, I think I look at a sort of an undercurrent of order is what the whole thing is, how to keep order. For them, how to keep order was to maintain these distinctions. And I think it's hard for us to understand today because now we live in the realm of the nation state where that has been, removed, at least in theory, at least by of this distinction, would, that at least in theory only. But it's really like the idea of order seems to be, and you talk about this, about how the early Muslim scholarship, the pre-modern period, they often had similar aligned goals with the political establishment in the sense of keeping this order, because as the political authorities, obviously they want to keep order in the society, but also for the scholarship, and I think well-meaning on their end is that you don't want social chaos. You want order because throughout our tradition, there's definitely a preference for order versus chaos because of all the dangers that can happen, religiously and just by people's own well-being. if
Right.
you have any type of disorder in society.
Right. Yeah. No, excellent. Yeah. Thank you. And I'm happy you read my arguments closely, mashallah. So you could really engage in the conversation. I mean, I always appreciate that. Mashallah. So no, absolutely. Right. So certainly it is within the objectives of these imperial administrators, right, from the caliph and down, to have a society, have order in the society, and then distinctions and hierarchies help ensure that order. So ulama too, they want to see a society that conforms to the will of God, right? They're looking to have a society that conforms to the will of God. Sure, they want people to pray, right? But also they want at least the social relations to also operate in a way that ensures order. And order can be achieved through hierarchical relations. And I'm not the only one that's written about the existence of hierarchy sort of within pre-modern Islamic societies. Others have within different contexts, right? Whether it be in the context of slavery, for example, or in the context of gender. And so that's one of the things that excited me about the book, is that it allowed me to think about Muslim relations with non-Muslims within this much larger kind of social and political frame. But yeah, and I think that's what they were attempting to do, because look, all of us are sinners, right? We're not perfect. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made us into fallible human beings. So it's not as if all Muslims, or even most Muslims, whether in the pre-modern or modern periods, are always going to be following the rules as the ulama would want them to follow the rules. So, for example, in the time of Ibn Taymiyyah, I have a chapter on Ibn Taymiyyah, a lot of fun to write about his text, Iqtida Sirat al-Mustaqim, Mukhalafat Ashab al-Jahim. The obligation of following the straight path is to be different from those damned to hell. I mean, that's the title of the book. It tells you everything you need to know about what he was trying to do, right? And to say this idea of being different is an Islamic doctrine. And, to be different and distinct from those damned to hell. He wanted to make his message very clear. He doesn't mince any words, right? This is Ibn Taymiyyah we're talking about. So he saw, and he talks about this in his book, that, look, there are Muslims in Damascus. They're doing things that they shouldn't be doing, in his view, right? They're going out, hanging out with Christians in their religious holidays, and mingling with the opposite sex and doing this, right? And he wants Muslims to follow the rules well. And so he thinks that the social order is being overturned. And the larger political context too is the caliphate had fallen just a few decades earlier, right? The Mongols had gone in and sacked Baghdad, and were posing a threat to the Mamluk Sultanate at that time. So this larger political shadow informs Ibn Taymiyyah's concerns over emulation and imitation and the presence of non-Muslims in public life in Damascus. And
if
so he wants.
Sure.
Please
just
go ahead.
If you could clarify, right. Just if you could just comment just briefly.
Right.
I think we might have glossed over this, but like Ibn Taymiyyah and the other scholars,
right.
What is the concern? I think, because based on the Hadith, right? There's an implication in the Hadith.
Right.
Okay, if you resemble one, you're going to be of that same people. So what's the consequence of that he's concerned about? Sure.
And he's concerned of as Muslims losing their religion, right? And acting in ways that they shouldn't be acting. And he cites several hadith about Muslims not celebrating holidays of others, right? Whether it be Nowruz or at least traditions of Athar. So, for him, these public festivals, these public holidays have a symbolic value, right? And this gets us into the subject of symbols. And but for him, he wants Muslims to conform to the will of God, and in particular, festivals, which is a focal point in the book, though not the only focal point. For him, is an area or a space where this bad imitation happening, where Muslims are becoming or beginning to blur into being non-Muslims, where Muslims are blurring into becoming Christians, as it were, and doing Christian things. And so this is very disturbing to him, and has larger political overtones given the sort of context in which he lived. Right, the caliphate had fallen. So this is so this idea of imitation, of choosing the wrong role models. Because when you imitate, you choose a role model, and the ideal role model is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so for him, Muslims are choosing the wrong role models. And so the idea of being different and distinct then is to say, look, even in this, what seems to be harmless to these ordinary Muslims that are going and celebrating Maundy Thursday or whatever it is, it actually has big consequences, not only for the way Muslims look, not only for Muslim society, but even potentially theologically, right? If they do certain acts, and there's certain acts that are so blatantly bad imitation that could fall into the realm of apostasy, like losing one's Islam, as it were, or at least committing an act of kufr in that specific instance. So he wants to warn ordinary Muslims, and maybe even elite Muslims who are too lax, even other fellow ulama, literate ulama, who might be not vigilant or themselves not think that these acts are important. So that's one of the main reasons why he writes this book. But then, getting back to your earlier point about order, so he sees this potential chaos taking shape in public life and wants to once again help to bring back order into Damascene society, at least in this particular realm. And he himself, fought jihad, right? In other spaces, he was commanding what is right and forbidding what is wrong. He also went to the sultan, and asked him to enforce what are called the sumptuary laws, certain laws governing non-Muslim dress that he thought were important to emphasize, that non-Muslim should be visibly recognized as non-Muslim by wearing certain headgear that are distinct and different from Muslims. So he wanted a society to visibly sort of reflect this ideal order from his perspective. And so he was very much attentive to these things, and Tashabbuh and the Hadith, man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum, and the discourse and doctrine around it was for him very important.
And this is where we really see sort of that where that Hadith really takes on a negative, starts to take on a very negative connotation in terms of what is the meaning of it, because you can have a negative or positive interpretation, which you also talk about as well in the book. There's this anxiety. I think this is one of the things that you recognize is that a lot of these scholars over the times are, concerned about this tashabbuh. There's a lot of these anxieties of the time that they're living in. So, like, for example, you mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah, like, the Mongols are really at the height of that period. And then you speak about other scholars as well, like in dealing with the situations they're dealing with, both internally as well as externally. There's this concern about the influence of groups within the society, or whether there are other deviant, quote deviant Muslim groups, or people from other faith communities, and the influence they're having on Muslims. So this concern about those, sort of the preservation of the integrity of the middle path of the deen. And you speak about this in detail in your book. One thing I thought it was interesting was, I mean, Ibn Taymiyyah, everyone has a certain an understanding, a very superficial understanding of Ibn Taymiyyah, but he's a very complex figure, and there's a lot of some interesting things that you mentioned about, like, for example, like he really looked into the idea of the maslaha of all, and also of the power of intention behind an act. Like, he didn't think like, certain deviant Muslims doing a practice was necessarily would really result in them going to, damnation because they had a good intention and they didn't know otherwise. So, I mean, there's these sort of, complexities to his thought process, which was very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, a great comment and insight again, and there, many sort of, layers I wish I could touch upon, or I hope I can touch upon. So, number one, you mentioned the sort of the hadith can kind of go both ways, as it were. If you think about it at face value, and I open the book with this idea, or at least I broached the subject quite early on, that when you say whoever imitates a people becomes one of them, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It doesn't have to be viewed and interpreted negatively. It can be interpreted or read as a positive exhortation, like, oh, whoever imitates a people becomes one of them, and that people could be good, and therefore you become like this noble, virtuous people. Or it could go in the opposite direction. And one of the things that the book attempts to grapple with is the fact that in a majority of cases, it has been interpreted and read negatively. But does it have to be, right? And I think that's one of the questions that I broach in the book that I think are important. And I think particularly important for Muslims to think about today in terms of how we, especially Muslims living in non-Muslim majority countries, how we interact with the religious other. The second point you make about Ibn Taymiyyah, and jurists more broadly reflecting certain anxieties, right? And in my original dissertation, I had sort of the word anxiety in the title, right? But then I thought, today in certain circles with mental health speak, anxiety has a particular connotation, and I don't want to make it seem that ulama, have mental health issues. That's not what is going on. So I wanted to be careful with that particular term and particular valence today. Yet at the same time, in this kind of restricted sense of anxiety, in terms of having concerns and worries about the Ummah and the integrity of the Ummah and the well-being of the Muslim realm, then Tashabbuh is a way of tracing those anxieties. And one of the interesting things that I found in my research was that most of these treatises against imitation were not written in pre-modern Islam. They were written after colonialism. And I think that speaks volumes to the trauma of colonialism to the Muslim world. And as something arguably unprecedented in terms of the scale of trauma that it has precipitated and continues to sort of, as it were, precipitate. But yeah, and Ibn Taymiyyah himself, despite being very concerned for the well-being of the Ummah, and this is sort of what is the charge of the ulama. Ulama are, as some people call them, guardians or custodians of this religious tradition. It's their job to be concerned, right? It's their job to be worried about the Ummah and our well-being and the community. And so Ibn Taymiyyah, like others before him and after him, were trying to fulfill this role and this responsibility, because it's one that they will be asked about on the Day of Judgment. Yet, and despite his concerns, as you mentioned, he was a nuanced thinker. And so this is something that I also try to emphasize, that and he sort of, I don't know if this is the right way to talk about it, but I mean, in the case of some Muslims participating in the Mawlid, he, even though he doesn't like this particular practice, right, and ulama are divided on the issue, but even though he doesn't like this particular practice, for Muslims who are weak in faith and who don't have knowledge, he argues that their good intention may actually make that act and the Day of Judgment and the world to come a praiseworthy act in the eyes of God. He doesn't offer that dispensation to Muslims who should know better and who have strong faith, because he wants to maintain the integrity of the Sharia in that regard, at least in his interpretation of the Sharia, right? But it does show that he's a nuanced thinker. He's thinking situationally, which is what we want ulama to do, even if we disagree with them. We want ulama to think situationally. We want our jurists to think situationally about subjects within fiqh. And so kind of connected to that, he argues that in non-Muslim lands, that tashabbuh is not required. Right? So in the default, the normative position is that tashabbuh, in the sense of reprehensible imitation of certain practices of non-Muslims and others, is something that Muslims should avoid. But in Dar al-Harb or Dar al-Kufr, right? These are the terms that he uses, and that's another, perhaps a podcast to talk about space in the Islamic imagination. But in these realms, right, what I will refer to as non-Muslim lands, where Muslims don't have political authority, where they're minorities, they're not required to observe these obligations, because there are other objectives that may be achieved by not emulating, or rather by not appearing distinct publicly, and rather simply just going with the flow, as it were. So, and that argument has been used by modern scholars, some modern scholars, to, let us say, relax, Islamic sort of traditional Islamic rulings on the subject of tashabbuh for Muslims in modernity, or Muslims living as minorities in non-Muslim contexts.
I want to talk a little bit about coffee.
Sure.
Because
I was drinking coffee just now.
yeah, because I think it's definitely very interesting to hear this little part of the story, especially to connect it with Ibn Taymiyyah, because Ibn Taymiyyah, as you mentioned, a lot of what his discussion is about Muslim participation, or in the festivals of the Jews and Christians in the society, which in itself, actually, I think it's worth mentioning that, like, throughout this period of Muslim history, it's a representative that a lot of the Jewish and Christian communities were quite vibrant, and they had quite a bit of influence in societies, which I think it's important to mention. And so it's so much so that some of the people like Ibn Taymiyyah, they're concerned about the overly influencing the Muslims in the community. But his argument in terms of is that that the Muslims are participating in this action of this religious festival of another, or being around it, and that there was a problem with it. But then you move into generations or centuries later to this issue of coffee in the Muslim world, where coffee in itself is not. I mean, yes, there was arguments about and it was haram for some time, according to many of the scholars, but over time it was considered, the drink itself was considered permissible, but there was this debate about where you drank it. So it wasn't even that, like, the action of drinking coffee was a problem. It was the company that you keep in these coffee houses, which in my mind, I think is actually very telling of this whole concern about tashabbuh in general, that a lot of the scholarly concern about it is not so much about the action, but it's about the company you keep, because imitation is really about it's a consequence of company. You're going to imitate the people who you're in company with. And so we have this anxiety and concern about Muslims drinking coffee in coffee houses. I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, it was a fun part of the book to write. I'll admit, as someone who has frequented coffee houses in the past and who continues to drink coffee. But I think, it's one of the things why I really, from an academic perspective, from an intellectual perspective, really enjoyed about this subject, is that it did take me from these, formal writings, right, in fiqh and tasawwuf and ethics in Islam. But it also, to understand what these ulama are doing, you have to also understand the social and cultural context of the time. And that for me was also interesting, because it forced me to do that, not simply to sort of inhabit the books themselves, as it were, on tashabbuh, but to look beyond them as well, to understand why were these ulama writing about what they were writing about. And so the subject of coffee comes up, and I'll give a little more background to the chapter, but one of my favorite figures in the book is a figure named Najm-ud-Din al-Ghazi, who was born in the 16th century, died in 1651, was a Shafi'i faqih from Gaza, right? Al-Ghazi indicates that his family originated from Gaza. They moved centuries before to Syria, was today called Syria, but still within the Levant and that region, more Sham, broadly understood. And so he was living in the Ottoman Empire, so a different political context from Ibn Taymiyyah, and several centuries after him. And then he wrote the most extensive work on Tashabbuh ever written, and called Husn at-Tanabbu lima warada fi Tashabbuh, or what I translate as the virtue of awakening to what has been transmitted about imitation. And at the time when I was initially doing my research, it wasn't published. It was still sort of still unpublished. And so what was exciting for me was to encounter the handwritten manuscripts that were available to in Damascus at that time. But then I learned of a top secret project that had been going on for years by the will of God, and that would eventually publish the book. And so in the published edition today, which you can find online, it's 12 volumes. So you can imagine, I mean, he spent nearly 40 years of his life writing this work. So the idea of imitation to him, and I think you've touched upon this as well, is about who we are as humans. And I think he was really captivated by this idea of imitation and the significance it has on who we are and who we become as individuals and as collectivities. But he was also a Sufi sheikh, a Sufi as well in the Qadiri Tariqa, and Ibn Taymiyyah may have been as well. But not getting into that debate right now, his sensibilities in this treatise are informed by his fiqh sensibilities, his sensibilities within tasawwuf, and just a kind of a capacious thinker. So one of the subjects that he talks about in this text, and it's not much, but it struck me, is on the coffee and the permissibility of coffee. And so what I love about so many of many pre-modern ulama is they sometimes wrote fatwa in the form of poems. And you don't see this much today, but I think it tells us something about life in Muslim lands at this time, that it was a thing to write fatwa and compose fatwa in versified form. I just think this says something about our Muslim aesthetic sensibilities and the high standards that we had, the respect we had for language, and conveying or aligning fiqh with beauty. Right. So that's probably another subject, but something that I appreciate. So he composes this fatwa in response to a petitioner about, is it okay to drink coffee? And so at that particular time, in the 17th century, coffee had been around, right, for at least a century or so. But there was a time in which coffee was new, and the ulama weren't sure about what its effects were and whether it had effects that could be parallel to those of wine in terms of intoxicating quality, because it can at least impact your disposition, maybe even your mood. So then does this enter into the realm of prohibition? And for some ulama in the early stages, yes, it did. It was something to be prohibited. It was prohibited by some of them. But then over time, ulama saw that the drink itself and the effects that it could have on the individual were not like that of wine, and sufficiently different enough to say, it's okay to drink, not haram. The problem, though, for Najm-ud-Din al-Ghazi is that, similar to Ibn Taymiyyah, there's these social practices that Muslims are engaging in, and it happens to be in the coffee house. So whereas Ibn Taymiyyah was concerned about Muslims participating in non-Muslim festivals, Najm-ud-Din al-Ghazi was not happy with Muslims going to coffee houses, where when you read the description of Najm-ud-Din al-Ghazi and others, they may, some at least, resemble that of a tavern, like a wine tavern, where people kind of come together and talk, but not necessarily about pious things. And so good company could mix with bad company. And so he talks about, for example, musical instruments and beardless youths, right? Young boys without beards, which were an object of sexual attraction to some men, right? So homoeroticism, which he critiques. And so he argues and he states in this fatwa that it's okay to drink coffee, but just don't do it in the coffee house. Keep it in the home. And he calls the coffee house the devil's lair. the devil's lair, like Majlis al-Shaitan, I guess. Because it kind of was this liminal space that brought people together and disrupted these hierarchies that were important to maintaining a social order, that was important to maintaining a society that conformed to the will of God, right? And we see this taking place. And so whether you agree with them or not, and today I think coffee houses are different spaces. They don't have the same valence that they necessarily did, at least some coffee houses, depending on where you go, but at least many coffee houses here in the United States, they don't have that kind of, they're not that type of space that Najm-ud-Din al-Ghazi is talking about. So you don't hear ulama prohibiting, we don't see many fatwa, right, of ulama telling Muslims, don't go to coffee houses. We don't see that much anymore. But at that particular time, it was a controversial issue. It was a controversial subject. And Najm-ud-Din al-Ghazi wrote a fatwa about it.
I think we'd be remiss also to you mentioned the Sufi sort of the idea. I mean, you mentioned the path of tasawwuf that Najm-ud-Din al-Ghazi was involved with, but you also mentioned in terms of the positive connotations of the hadith itself, how some of the people of tasawwuf, they would use this or understand this narration in the sense of the positive, in a positive connotation, meaning that like the people who want to be like the most elect, that type of imitation that will bring them closer into that elect company.
Yeah, you're asking all the right questions. Alhamdulillah, Salim, I appreciate it. Yeah, absolutely. And so this is one of the things that I think also surprised me and delighted me at the same time, was to once again recalling the positive, I guess, potential of this idea of tashabbuh, of imitation. That when you look outside of many of the fiqh contexts in which tashabbuh was written about, right? And you look at it in some Sufi discursive contexts, such as the within the Suhrawardi Sufi order, and there are a couple of shuyukh that wrote about tashabbuh in that context. They did so in a very different way, and it wasn't sort of charged with the same concerns and anxieties, if you allow me to use that word, that some of the ulama would write about. Rather, they were concerned about how does this subject, or how does this idea of imitation work within a Sufi order, a tariqah, and how can it manage relations between sort of the novices, right, the newbies, the noobs, as my wife would say, the Sufi noobs, and the shuyukh. How can and look, I will say also that there's a hierarchy within tariqas, within Sufi orders, right? You have those that are very much advanced on the path, and you have those that are just starting, and you have those that are just bad, right? They're not good Sufis. So for them, they kind of use this idea of tashabbuh as a path for the Sufi novices to be included within the Sufi community, and the idea that tashabbuh could be a path to piety. And when I was in Damascus, I visited a sheikh in Aleppo. And I had a chance to spend a couple of days with him, alhamdulillah, and talk about the subject with him. And very well respected sheikh. And one of the first things he taught me when I mentioned the subject is this couplet: "In lam takunu minhumu fatashabbahu, inna tashabbaha bil kirami falah." If you cannot be like the pious or the virtuous, then imitate them. For imitating the virtuous or pious is success. And this is because he wanted to convey to me that there's this other register in which we can talk about emulation. There's this other register in which we can talk about tashabbuh. And it's one that is about our spiritual path that all Muslims, face. Like, how do we become more pious? How do we become like the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? How could we become like the person we want to become? Right. And so this couplet conveys that it begins with finding virtuous role models and beginning to emulate them at the surface level, so that one day, inshallah, even if, we can associate with them, but that inshallah, that these qualities or these attributes can over time become ingrained within us and then transform us. So tashabbuh, as I argue in the book, is a transformative technology of the self. It can be, at least, if viewed within this particular perspective. And so I found this a powerful way of thinking about tashabbuh as almost like a counter discourse within this broader discourse, if you will, and one that I think shaped someone like Najm-ud-Din al-Ghazi and how he talked about it. So he talks about tashabbuh not only as a negative thing, as something that you got to be careful of, but also as a positive thing. And he talks about different situations and contexts in which Muslims can find positive role models, whether it be the shuhada or the salihin, etc., or the prophets, alayhimus salam, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, angels, malaika, etc., even certain animals, which I think was really fascinating. The last two volumes of this treatise are dedicated to animals. So animal rights activists out there, you can rejoice. So even certain animals provide positive role models for Muslims to emulate. And how can we think about these non-human exemplars, right? And this way it kind of overturns the hierarchy a little bit, where humans are allegedly superior to animals, which I appreciate. But yeah, I think that was really one of the fascinating aspects of this particular treatise, is that 2 volumes are dedicated to the virtues or the vices of animals. And even Taymiyyah even broaches the subject of animals, but not nearly to the extent that Najm-ud-Din al-Ghazi does.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Like, be productive like a bee, and don't overwork like an ant. I didn't know that ants like overwork themselves. But I think as you mentioned in his the way he organizes his work, he starts with angels and then he sort of finishes with animals, which I think is very apropos, because we as human beings, we reside sort of in between those 2 extremes of being angelic or being beastly. Even in the sciences of tasawwuf, this is something that is the angelic self versus the beastly self. I just briefly, if you could just mention a little bit about before you come, we end with some of the conclusions about tashabbuh in general, though. If you could just touch on a little bit about Muhammad Abdu and this controversy of Muslims wearing European hats, because this is a time that's not too far removed from us today, and I think a lot of us, in the way we conceptualize tashabbuh, just as previous generations did, it is primarily through this very external style and external clothing, and how we fashion ourselves externally. This is typically the way it's understood, like the way we understand tashabbuh is a lot of times is just like what we wear. So if you could touch a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's another big subject. I think the chapter was like 35 pages, if I remember correctly. And that was like a new chapter in the book that wasn't in the dissertation, because in the original study, it ended at Najm-ud-Din al-Ghazi. But then for the book, and one of the reasons why it took me a little bit longer to write, I wanted to think about tashabbuh more in modernity. And I thought that this particular subject, which one historian has called the most controversial fatwa in the history of Islam, right? That's what one historian has called it. So once again, there's context to this. So Muslim, and this is a time in which Muslims were living within Transvaal, South Africa, as a minority in a Christian majority, and they petitioned, right? Muhammad Abdu, who was at that time in the early 1900s, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, and this is under British control at that particular time. And they asked him, is it okay, and among other topics, is it okay to eat meat slaughtered by non-Muslims? Is it okay for Hanafis and Shafi'is to pray behind one another in prayer? And is it okay for us to wear a buruneta, which is a European-styled brimmed hat? So the key here, and what makes this hat European, is that it has a brim, right? Think of a derby or some other caps that you might see at a hat store, for example. Is it okay for us to wear it? And in his fatwa, he says, which eventually caused a firestorm of controversy. He said, yeah, it's okay for you to wear that hat. And he kind of also invokes the spirit of Ibn Taymiyyah in this fatwa, in the sense that recognizing that these are Muslims living in a non-Muslim majority context. So he doesn't say it's haram and prohibits them from wearing it. He says if there's a maslaha, right, and this is once again invoking sort of the spirit of Ibn Taymiyyah, then the maslaha could be for protecting against the sun, for example, so as being something more salubrious or healthful for the Muslim, among other masalih or objectives, and permits them, as it were, to wear the brimmed hat. And then once this fatwa got out, it just, quote unquote, all hell broke loose. I mean, for lack of a better word. So, I mean, I get into the details of the book and what took place, right? Even in the media of that time, print media, which is relatively new, Muhammad Abdu was lampooned. And one of the images, like a dog is licking his thobe, in an attempt to smear him as a collaborator and as one who doesn't know, as it were, was a European sympathizer, one who had betrayed, as it were, his Muslimness by allowing this to take place. And then for decades, there were debates over whether it's okay to wear a brimmed hat or not. And it just speaks to this, number one, the tensions between Europe and Muslims at the time. Because look, this was also in the sort of the peak of colonialism, right? Where Muslims, not just in Egypt and but in India and elsewhere most of the world has at one point been colonized by a European country or European empire. So it's something that rippled throughout the Muslim world, as it were, because among many Muslims, right, whether it be in Egypt or Syria or Turkey or elsewhere within the Ottoman Empire, wore the fez cap, or what we today call the fez cap. And that was the sort of signature style, masculine style that told the world, look, I'm a Muslim, or I'm from the Muslim world. And then to allow Muslims to sort of adopt these European sartorial norms, many Muslims were like, no, you've crossed the line, right? This is it's a sign of capitulation, of surrender, the fact that we are the abased and the subordinate, and the Europeans, who are also read as Christian, right? Because that's where Europe is formerly Christendom, as the elites and those in power, and it's almost was viewed by so many, and why it caused so much controversy. At least one of the reasons why it caused so much controversy.
And this actually, I think also to just interject for a moment was, and you make a point throughout your whole book about that imitation is also about power. You imitate the one who's the imitator is not as good as the model, and this factors into this harmful imitation in this scenario.
Yeah, and another a key point, and you can sort of see why it took me a long time to write this book, because there's just so much there. I mean, power is another big thing, right? Ibn Khaldun speaks of imitation in relation to power, the conquered and the conqueror. And I cite Ibn Khaldun, who's this brilliant social thinker, Muslim social thinker, and yes, and it does bring into, and why I think Tashabbuh still has, it's what this hassasiyah, it elicits a hassasiyah, the sensitivities among Muslims, as it were. And it's what one sheikh called sensitivity, because it does bring it to relief. It does sort of elicit these anxieties over power that Muslims still have today, right? Whether when you look at Gaza and you look at what's going on there and the way it's represented in at least the Western mainstream media, it brings to the surface these anxieties, this pain, right? This confusion over this apparent subordinate status that Muslims appear to have in so much of the world today. So Tashabbuh, and at that time, the fatwa on hats and the burneta certainly elicited those anxieties and concerns and traumas, right? I think trauma is not a incorrect word to use for many Muslims. I will say that over time, Muslims got over it, right? It took into the 1950s for many Muslims just to forget about it. So now you'll go to a mosque, you'll go to the Middle East, and you'll find Muslim, even ulama, wearing brimmed hats, baseball hats, whatever, the derby. And because it reflected a particular point in time that this hat and this style of headgear had a particular symbolic meaning and symbolic value. And that's another thing that I talk about in the book is the power of symbols that symbols have. Think about if you burn the American flag and the outrage that it could have elicited among many Americans. This is something that Ibn Taymiyyah talks about explicitly, the importance of symbols in Islam. In Safa wal Marwa min sha'irillah, this is a Quranic verse, that Safa and Marwa among the symbols of God, or the waymarks, the markers of God. So this gets us into thinking about symbols, and social thinkers have talked about, for example, the importance and power of symbols in shaping communal identity. And this is something that Ibn Taymiyyah and ulama before him and ulama after him were sensitive to, and because they realized that these symbols, these shi'ar, are playing a very important role in shaping Muslim social relations. And to what degree are Muslims, in terms of constructing a style, tasked with creating symbols that define what it means to be Muslim in public life? And this is something that Muslims today, I think, need to really think about consciously and intentionally.
I mean, you mentioned about symbols, as we move to sort of now in terms of this, the idea of tashabbuh and what it means for us today. One thing I wanted to mention that you also talk about when you talked about the issue of the hats was one of the reasonings that eventually, the promoters of the sort of the permissibility of the hat was that this, what we see in the current situation of governments and nation states, was that like this connotation between a people and the religion, it became more of the separation of faith and of religion and state. And so that was not really a religious dress. So one of the arguments they used was that this is not like a symbol of religious dress, which I think sort of ties into what my question about the symbols, especially today. You talk about how certain symbols have remained throughout the Muslim community from the very beginning, based on recommendations and of the Prophet ﷺ. Of course, beard is one of those symbols that's persisted throughout history. Others you mentioned are not as stressed. Like, for example, praying with shoes on. Like, for obvious reasons, over time, Muslims have said, like, well, we're not going to do this in the masjid, because to keep it clean. So that even though you can pray in your shoes and it's permissible, that's not really like the real symbol of Muslim identity that people were clinging onto. It was things which were, even, for example, you talk about the beard, the dyeing of the beard, and that is in narrations of the Prophet ﷺ, that was not understood to the same level of I want to say, given the same importance by many people as just the beard itself. And then actually even the dyeing of the beard became almost appropriated by some groups within the Muslim community, which were considered not the best groups. And so because of that, people didn't want to associate that so much. So they did not emphasize that point as much. If you could speak a little bit as we talk about how we conceptualize tashabbuh today, in terms of how Muslims are to remain different, especially in a society where we're not living in the realm of empire, we're living in the realm of a nation state, where there is, at least in theory, as we mentioned earlier, we're supposed to be all sort of the same. If you will, we're all the same home, we're all the same people. We're not like these sub communities anymore. We're all citizens of a nation state. And yet, how do Muslims, number one, understand, okay, well, who are we supposed to be different from? If religion has been taken out of society, like it has been in many societies now today, okay, then does this even apply anymore? Is it obsolete? Or is it, on the other hand, are we just supposed to assert a certain identity and a style just to show that we are Muslim?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge question. And, I think it really probably needs another book, if I'm honest. I mean, I do try to broach the subject in the conclusion, but it's really just the beginning and beginning to think about these subjects. But yeah, I mean, number one, to your point about change, this is something that I think is important for Muslims to keep in mind, is that when you look at the subject of these particular practices, such as growing the beard, some have endured, right? Some have endured, and others have, like the European brimmed hat, or even drinking coffee in a coffee house. Certain practices have sort of, as it were, become forgotten, for lack of a better word, and are no longer of concern to Muslims today, or at least in many places today. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. One of the things that I think is important for all Muslims to know is that Islam, as a tradition, as a historical tradition, is not static; it's dynamic, and it's one that is shaped by the past, and as well as the present. And this is what our ulama are constantly trying to navigate, right? Navigate the past and the present, and sort of forge a path forward for the ummah in a way that is affirming of who we are. This is a challenge. It's not easy, and you're not going to have everyone agree on what that should be. So that's one of the things that's important to keep in mind, is this continuity and rupture, as we say, in the field of academia, or the field of history. So one of the, I think, in terms of charting a path forward for Muslims today, some ulama, right, they offer a very minimalist, as it were, ruling on tashabbuh. So they will say that it really only applies to ibadah nowadays. So when you talk about ibadah, right, whether it be prayer or fasting, we don't alter the ibadah. We don't copy from someone else and say, we're going to pray 6 times a day because this group prays 6 times a day. We're not going to do add an extra rak'ah to Maghrib because some group is adding an extra rak'ah to Maghrib, or whatever it might be. We're not going to fast 2 months in the year and make it obligation because so-and-so community fasts 2 months in a year. So they say, well, tashabbuh really only applies to ibadah, and then this other realm, whatever the realm of the social and the cultural, you can do what you want. And so this is what I would call a minimalist kind of definition of tashabbuh that you see some ulama advancing today to make life easier, especially for Muslims living in non-Muslim territories. That's not the only, but however, that's not the only position that's advanced among ulama today. Some continue to advance the more, for lack of a better word, maximalist positions that were held by many ulama in the past as well about tashabbuh, in terms of it not only encompassing the realm of ibadah or worship or devotion, but also encompassing the realm of social and cultural life. So this creates a position for the ordinary Muslim. Is like, which way do I go, right? And we're at a crossroads, and this is one of the challenges of being Muslim today, is trying to figure out how to be Muslim given that there's this diversity of viewpoints and opinion. And in the book, I argue that we should take into account the fact that the political context in which most Muslims live today is not an empire, it's a nation state. And we should think about, hierarchy and whether this remains an ideal in the way that it did in the past for many Muslims. And that at the very least should maybe inspire us and provoke us to think maybe differently about imitation. Why? Because in many of the discourses on tashabbuh, there's this idea, especially with regard to non-Muslims, there's this idea that to be one of them is intrinsically a bad thing. That it's not possible for them, these others, to be virtuous exemplars. And I don't know if that's a very helpful attitude to uphold, or useful, even accurate, to be honest with you. I know that I can speak for myself, and yes, I mean, I try to be a good Muslim, right? As I think so many of us and your viewers do. But I certainly have been inspired by many non-Muslims I've encountered with, as I'm sure you have, if we're honest. I remember I was walking early morning in the United Kingdom. I was in Oxford last term. And it was early morning, and I saw a lady who ostensibly was not Muslim. It's possible, but I don't believe she was. She early in the morning saw a beer bottle that was on the side of the road, took out a tissue, picked up the beer bottle and tossed it into the garbage.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so taken with that.
I mean, that's like the Hadith.
Yeah. It's like the Hadith, but I was like, wow, and I was just inspired by her. She wanted to keep Oxford a clean city. She was repulsed by the idea of litter, and the idea that the bottle may harm somebody. Who knows? So then a few minutes later, I saw a piece of garbage, and like, you know what? I'm just going to imitate her, and I'm going to do one small thing. I'm going to pick up that litter and toss it into the garbage. That's what I did. I literally imitated her. Mm-hmm. I literally did what she did, and that's not. I mean, yes, it conforms to the spirit of Islam, right? Tuhur shatrul iman. Cleanliness is half of faith, right? And so it's not as if this idea is alien to who we are as Muslims. But that particular act helped me at that particular moment to be a better Muslim, right? To embody my Muslimness better. So I think, for those of us who are inspired by many of the religious others that we encounter in our everyday lives, that we need to rethink then, or at least approach a bit differently, the subject of imitation and the possibilities of us being inspired to be better Muslims by our encounters with non-Muslims. And we need to kind of have readings of the Hadith that take this into account. And that's what I begin to do in the final chapter of the book. So what that means then is that we think of ourselves as, for those of us that live in nation states and are fortunate to have residency and citizenship here. I realize that not everyone does, right? There's a refugee crisis among Muslims in many parts of the world. And the nation state can be a very nasty place to live, right? I don't want to idealize it. And maybe I'm too soft on the nation state in the book. I don't know. Maybe that's a legitimate critique. But I do think that for thinking about who we are within the nation state and our citizenship in this country, or, in a country like the United States, that we need to think about what it means to emulate and be different in a slightly different way. One that I think enhances our relations with non-Muslims, creates possibilities for belonging, right? And this is a subject that we talked about before we went live, is how do you feel a sense of home as Muslims? I think many Muslims struggle with that. How to feel a sense of home. I belong. And I think one of the ways in which we can do that is by figuring out how to interact with non-Muslims in the nation state in a way that advances common objectives and a common vision for the good life that we have. And so this is the direction I'm trying to kind of push with this in the book. Does that mean then that we wipe out what makes us distinct, or does it mean that we enforce a particular kind of difference upon all Muslims everywhere? I argue that part of what I think is important for us to do, and for the ulama class to do, is to allow Muslims and encourage Muslims to figure out how they wish to embody their distinction and their uniqueness. That not to advance a one-size-fits-all Islam. That I think could be very counterproductive. And
that's
so
something
that might, please
that's
go
something
on.
you also mention in the sense that, like, we're talking about the scholars as guardians, right, of the tradition, right? But
Right.
within the realm that they're guarding, right, the Muslims are able freely to articulate and practice Islam in a natural way. And you mentioned that Muslims, even in the very the hierarchy of empire of all those centuries, right, that the Muslim, I don't know, lay people, if I could use that term, the way they practice and live their life, they had a difference in the sense that they were Muslim and that they were proud to be Muslim, and they had this style that was Muslim, but they were still able to interact hospitably and kindly and generously with those communities which were not Muslim, who thrived in those same lands, which I think is very instructive, that this doesn't necessarily have to be, as you term, like a binary in terms of how we view non-Muslims. I mean, when in my mind, a lot of tashabbuh, the issue of tashabbuh is it's like two categories. This the effect on you yourself as a Muslim in terms of how you see yourself, and there is a crisis in terms of how Muslims feel confident or not confident in their religion, right? And so how you dress, how you style yourself, that can be representative of how you feel about who you are and your identity. And that's part of, I think, one of the wisdoms in that there are these small differences that the Prophet ﷺ encouraged for the early Muslim community and us to have these symbols. But at the same time, there's also, and then on the other side of tashabbuh is also, okay, how do we see other people? Like, do we see it positively through the lens of the hadith, or do we see it negatively? I think there's room for both, as you've mentioned. I think there's room for positive in the sense of looking for positive elements, whether they're in non-Muslim society or within a Sufi tariqa or with the masjid or wherever.
Right.
Find those positive things and imitate them. But then also on the other side is stay away from those negative things which you do not imitate. And I think honestly, for today, the way I sort of conceptualize, especially this hadith, is not necessarily the external things, but like don't fall into those same ideologies, philosophies, epistemology, which have a negative consequence to your deen, right? In the sense that, like, and I think I mean, I'm sure some of these scholars in the past talked about this internal, like, the way we think or the philosophies, like, they were worried about Muslims following into, like, say, Greek rationalism and things like that. I mean, like, that would be like, if at a time, I'm sure, like, okay, dress is a certain way, but, be careful how you think, you don't want to be like some of these philosophers, or, in the negative sense, I'm saying, right? So it's like today, it's like, we're influenced by a lot of, ways of being and ways of thinking, ways of learning that have a negative effect on us as Muslims. Shouldn't we be more worried of those sort of negative imitations of those frames?
Yeah, I think you make several really good points and important points to kind of think about, right? And yeah, and I think these are one of the challenges. I went to Princeton last week, and one of the things that my conversations with the Muslim Students Association there, great conversations, a great bunch of kids there, mashallah. One of the things that I found interesting that they do is on every Thursday, that many of the male brothers will wear a kufi on Thursday in solidarity with with the Muslim sisters who wear hijab, so they aren't shouldering the burden of being visibly Muslim, which I thought was very interesting. And so this kind of brought up the idea of what use or usefulness does being visibly distinct have within a particular public on the campus of Princeton University in particular. And they made this very conscious decision to implement this kind of Muslim difference for Muslim men in this particular way. So I, as an outsider, didn't feel it right to legislate one way or another. Like, this is, I see their wisdom behind it, and I was like, alhamdulillah, this kind of may make sense. But is this something that, is going to necessarily be applied in other contexts? I think it'll depend on the particular community it'll depend on the particular community and the context that they're in. I mean, we also have to take into account that Islam in the West is not one thing. To be Muslim in France is different from being Muslim in the United States. The receptivity to public forms of Islam are different in the United States than they are in France. Another reason why we can't have one size fits all Islam. But with your point about sort of a less of an emphasis on the exterior manifestations of one's Islam. And I think that's more of that fits into a broader modern trend of religion, right? Part of being modern, as it were, especially in Western contexts, has meant a increasing emphasis on the interiority, on the of religion being a private thing, a personal thing. We hear that many times, and as part of being a distinctive feature of what it means to be religious in modern day America. And so it's not wrong then for, or at least I would say it's not strange then for Muslims also who are living in these contexts to also think about their faith in that way. And so what you mentioned about ideology, scholars or ulama have written about the ghazwa fikri, or the ideological or intellectual attack, at least what many have framed as that, as an intellectual attack on Muslim ways of thinking originating from the West. And so there are books written about this, sometimes in conversation with Tashabbuh, and but oftentimes outside the discourse of Tashabbuh, in terms of thinking about how we think and the ideas that shape how we are. So this is huge, and I think this is where academics, and I appreciate you having academics on your show, I think play an important role in helping to, at least as being conduits for the broader Muslim community here in the United States and elsewhere, to help to think through, because it's not easy. It's there's so many disciplines out there: anthropology, sociology, philosophy, etc. And ulama today are tasked with a huge challenge to make sense of all these ideas and to help sort of fit Islam, and the Muslim community intellectually, socially, culturally, politically into the landscape. And I think this is why it's so important for Muslims to have not merely individuals working within academia and beyond, but institutions, educational institutions that really help, bring the best Muslim thinkers together, of different ideological orientations, because that's the reality of Muslim life here, and to figure this stuff out and to help shepherd the Muslim community on a path forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I think one of the overarching themes from the book, or what I learned, was that, or at least what I guess a take home point for me in learning this history and trying to apply it today is, again, like, Muslims can be proud that they're Muslim, and they can
Absolutely.
have small differences in their appearance. And
Mm-hmm.
I was in no means trying to minimize any of that, but I was trying to point out more about, like, that we also should be aware of that these internal things which influence us as well. We have to be careful of what we're imbibing.
Mm-hmm.
But like, Muslims can be proud, and they can be proud Muslims, and they can have some level of difference. And as you said, it's going to be different in each context, and that's very, very important. And it's probably prudent for Muslims to like indigenize that difference, like according to where they are. And that's actually what happened. And that's why Muslims, like wherever they were,
who they want to be, and who they want to be. Right.
And I think the point you make very well is that, like, throughout history, and really this is what sort of Islam connects, you have to connect to the world you're living in, regardless of what situation we find ourselves in today. I mean, we can lament about the loss of the status of religion, for example, like in the United States or Europe, right? But that's the world we live in today. It doesn't mean that we fall into that, but we have to understand how to connect with that type of world. So how do we do that? I mean, these are some of the questions you pose in the book. One of the things that I found very powerful in your conclusion was about, again, talking about sort of this internal work on the self in how we navigate this idea of tashabbuh, like, rather than looking at it as like, that's me against them and that I have to marginalize the other. No, let me first work on myself and make sure that myself, it's not like my drive is not because of my nafs trying to exert power over this other, whoever they may be. I'm reminded of this the story of one story. One of the disciples came to him, the scholar, and said, like, I pushed this other person off the road, or sort of pushed him towards the side of the road, who was from a different faith community. And he was sort of proud of himself. But then the scholar said, just you should push your nafs off the road, because where is that coming from, right? It's because that's the whole idea here. It's like, okay, how do I perceive the other? look at it from a positive sense. Yes, be Muslim and be proud of that, but don't let that influence your negative feeling towards that person of the other communities. Because I would dare say that that's not prophetic.
Right.
Like Yusuf alayhi salam, even like the story of him is that he was in prison. He was under all this difficulty, but he still had a positive feeling towards of the people of the land he was in.
Right.
The Prophet ﷺ always had a positive feeling in the sense that he wanted guidance for everybody.
Yes.
So to have this sort of negative feeling towards the other, and I understand that naturally happened because of that's what naturally can happen, but to guard ourselves from that really requires work on ourselves to make sure that it's not enough zani drive is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. No, another really important point. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, look, we want to be proud of who we are as Muslims, right? And how we manifest that and how that pride is manifested is going to differ. So I tend to be more introverted and kind of low key, but other Muslims are very extroverted. And so if Muslims, if a Muslim said, I want to wear green and a green turban, and I know Muslims like that everywhere I go, because to signal my love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and to signal my commitment to a particular tariqah, it's not my place to tell them you're being too different. Likewise, a Muslim who's working in, say, a law firm, and to have any kind of signal and has certain maybe career ambitions and may wish to kind of keep on the down low, but wakes up for tahajjud and fasts twice a week and does all the stuff that a believer does, but does so in a low key way. Their difference, as it were, is being manifested in that way that feels authentic to them. And I think I kind of struggle with this on my own, like how. I think this is where we want to create a community where we allow Muslims to figure out how to be Muslim, and allow for the visible manifestations of that difference to be diverse, because we are a diverse community with diverse experiences. I haven't even talked about Black American Muslims and how how being African American and how race has shaped their perception of Muslim difference and what it means to be Muslim in public life. And that's also an important subject to talk about. And my interactions with many Black Muslims and conversations about this topic certainly informed how I think about the subject. But yeah, and I think, inshallah, having a discourse on imitation that empowers who we are. And as you said, we are empowered by gaining self-mastery. And mastering the self, and recognizing that we are all Bani Adam, and this way we don't have to raise ourselves by putting down others.
Yes,
but we can raise ourselves and raise others up, and we can do so by recognizing ittaqu firasatul mu'min fa innahu yanzuru bi nurillah, that beware of the firasa of the true believer, because he sees with the light of Allah. And if we see with the light of Allah, then we see the divine sort of spark in all of creation, right? Animal, human, non-human, Muslim, non-Muslim. And this is one way we can raise up non-Muslims, as it were, to even a better space than they see themselves, that at least many see themselves. And this is a way I think Islam can be portrayed or perceived as a productive force in our society. It has something to give. We have something to give American society. We have something to give. And I think our projection of Muslim difference, I would say I would want that to be the way in which our difference manifests itself, the way we become exemplars, and that we try to lift all people up. If we're perceived in that way, and we act in that way, I think this is a way the Muslim community can thrive and feel that we have a space to be truly proud of who we are.
I mean, just one more reflection. It's almost the way in terms of your of uplifting the society, of this benefit for all, right? And that's sort of our ethos as Muslims. Certainly, based especially in our example of the Prophet ﷺ and the righteous forebears. And I almost look at it in a Sirah perspective, like the time of Hudaybiyah, right? Where the whole point for Muslims really is we're trying to convey this message, this beautiful message we have, this light, right? And the whole point is, and you could even argue that the initial engagement of the Muslims with other nations was based on this idea of removing the obstacles to conveying the message, allowing that message to be articulated freely, right? That was the beauty of Hudaybiyah, right? That was why it was a victory, because when you cease hostilities, what's going to naturally come up to the top? It's this the truth becomes manifest. And I really one thing you mentioned in your discussion about the European hats, like you give some examples of some statements of some of the scholars there, and one of them was a contemporary of Muhammad Abdul Rashid Rida, right? And he has sort of a spectrum of how he feels about the practice, and he considered it permissible, but then he felt it wasn't befitting, but it's still permissible. It was a very nuanced opinion, which I very much appreciated. But in sort of his earlier writing, which I think still applies and it's not abrogated in any way, was that by people sharing in this sort of culture of the land they live in, when people do that from different communities, the discord is removed. By removing, it allows them to see the qualities in each other. And so by removing that, by being on that stage where you're sharing in this practice or sharing this experience as people in the society together, and that discord or these feelings are removed, maybe even temporarily, what happens as a result is that the truth prevails. It comes to the top. And that's sort of like what our mission is. It's to be receptacles or vehicles, if you will, for that, to allow for that truth to become manifest through our own example, through following the example of the Prophet ﷺ, trying to be the best Muslims we can be wherever we may be. And by doing so, inshallah, people can see that truth, and the truth will be able to be manifest to them through our beautiful example and through our concern for uplifting society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a beautiful, conclusion. And yeah, I mean, through Tashabbuh, we can live our best lives. And through Tashabbuh, we can help other people live their best lives. And I think if we try to do that as an Ummah, and others see us as trying to do that, only good can come out of that.
Alhamdulillah. This was really a treat for me. I thank you so much for spending time, with us on the podcast to discuss this book. I really recommend it. I think it's great to anyone interested in religious studies, history, everything. It just has so many layers to it, which I very much appreciated. And it really gave me a very, alhamdulillah, good perspective, a different perspective, I should say, of a topic that actually, I'll be honest with you, like I haven't thought about this topic in a while. So when I started reading the book, I felt like I was like in an MSA back in the 90s again. Because that was a real big thing. I don't know if you remember. It was a real big thing, this topic of Tashabbuh. It was like a big thing, especially when you're in college, right? It's like you're all about your identity and your style. And that was like just really tied into it. So I was definitely getting nostalgic vibes, both good and bad, by exploring this topic. But I think it's a really, really important topic, especially as you mentioned, all the things that Muslim community, both in non-Muslim lands and in Muslim lands, are dealing with today. So I really thank you, Dr. Patel, for taking time on your very busy schedule and sharing these insights with us.
No, Jazakallah khair, Salim. I really appreciated your thorough engagement with the book. Alhamdulillah, that's and as an academic, whatever, that's what we really hope for. And I wrote this book not only with academics in mind. Yes, I want to speak to my colleagues, but I also wrote it thinking about myself a couple of decades ago as a young Muslim trying to find his way in the world. And had in mind Muslims today who are trying to find, young Muslims today and old Muslims and middle-aged Muslims today who are trying to find their way. And my hope is that it makes a contribution to that. And once again, I'm really grateful for you having me on here. And I just pray and hope that we can all move forward. It's a tough time. It's a difficult time to be Muslim right now, not only here in the United States, but really everywhere. And inshallah, our Muslim difference and what makes us special can shine through the light that we share with the world, inshallah.
Inshallah. Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair. To our listeners, thank you again for joining us on another program. Be sure to check out our latest episodes on al-Madina.org. Subscribe to the podcast, so we're available on multiple platforms. So you subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, will be available. Share the podcast with friends and family. And until then, I'll see you in the next podcast. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.